You wake up with a fever, your whole body aches, there's no medicine cabinet to raid, no pharmacy down the street, no doctor you can call. For most of human history, this wasn't a rare emergency. This was just Tuesday. For roughly 95% of the time humans have existed, illness meant something completely different than it does now. No antibiotics, no imaging scans, no painkillers in a bottle. Just you, your body, and the people around you. So what actually happened when someone got sick 50,000 years ago? Did they just die? Sometimes, but not as often as you might think. Let's start with something surprising. In 2018, researchers led by archaeologist Tim Maloney discovered the remains of a young man in Borneo who had lived roughly 31,000 years ago. His left leg had been surgically amputated below the knee. He survived for years afterward. That means someone performed the amputation, someone treated the wound to prevent infection, and someone cared for him through a recovery period where he couldn't hunt, gather, or walk. This wasn't an isolated case. Anthropologist Lorna Tilley studied a skeleton from Vietnam known as Man Back Burial 9, a young man who had been paralyzed from the waist down for most of his life, likely from a condition similar to polio. He lived into his 20s. Someone fed him, cleaned him, and kept him alive for over a decade despite contributing nothing physically to the group's survival. Here's the term anthropologists use for this: the bioarchaeology of care. It's the study of physical evidence in bones that shows long-term illness or disability was met with sustained support rather than abandonment. So the picture is already more complicated than ancient life was nasty, brutish, and short. But let's go deeper. What did they actually do when someone got sick? The first thing to understand is that ancient humans were not clueless about medicine. They were master botanists out of necessity. Anthropologist Richard Lee, who spent years living with and studying the Juhoanzi Sand people of the Kalahari Desert in the 1960s, documented that they used over 100 different plant species for medicinal purposes. Everything from treating digestive issues to wound care to fever reduction. Think about that for a second. Over 100 plants, not randomly chosen, tested, refined, and passed down across generations through trial, observation, and oral tradition. Some of this knowledge wasn't even unique to humans. Researchers studying Neanderthal remains at Sidron Cave in Spain found dental plaque containing traces of poplar bark, which contains salicylic acid, the same compound found in aspirin, along with what appears to be a naturally occurring antibiotic mold. One of the individuals studied had a dental abscess. He was self-medicating, or being medicated, for pain and infection with chemistry 48,000 years ago. So when someone in an ancient community got sick, step one often looked less like helplessness and more like a pharmacy built entirely from observation. But plants weren't the whole story. The second thing that mattered enormously was something much simpler. You were never sick alone. Hunter-gatherer groups were typically small, often 25 to 50 people, but tightly interdependent. If you got sick, the group didn't just leave you behind because the group itself depended on shared labor, shared food, and shared knowledge. Letting a member die without effort wasn't just emotionally costly. It was a loss of skills, memory, and social capital the group couldn't easily replace. This is where it gets interesting. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who has spent decades studying the Juhoanzi, documented something called H-Zaro, a system of gift exchange and reciprocal obligation. If you helped someone when they were sick, weak, or in need, that created a social debt, someday you might be the one who's sick. The system worked because everyone eventually ends up on both sides of it. In other words, caring for the sick wasn't purely altruistic, it was insurance. And it was built into the social fabric so deeply that opting out wasn't really an option. Your survival later depended on your generosity now. Now let's reconstruct what this might have actually looked like. Imagine you're part of a small group, maybe 30,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now southern France. You wake up coughing, your chest burning, fever rising. The first person to notice isn't a doctor. It's whoever is closest, maybe your sister, maybe an elder. The elder has seen this before many times. She knows which plants ease a fever, which barks calm a cough, which roots, when chewed, reduce swelling. She's not guessing. She's drawing on decades of observed outcomes passed to her by someone who learned it the same way, going back further than anyone can remember. While she prepares something, others adjust. Someone takes over your share of foraging for the day. Someone keeps the children near you because isolation wasn't the instinct. Proximity was. Touch, presence, and warmth weren't just comfort. They were, in many cases, genuinely useful, especially for hypothermia, shock, or simple fever management. If the illness was serious, a deep wound, a broken bone, a difficult birth, the group's collective memory kicked in. Splinting techniques, wound cleaning methods using certain plant resins with antimicrobial properties, even rudimentary cauterization using fire, evidenced by burn marks found on some ancient skeletal remains near healed fractures. And if you didn't recover quickly, the group didn't necessarily move on without you. Evidence from multiple sites, including Shanidar Cave in Iraq, where a Neanderthal individual known as Shanidar I lived for years with a withered arm, partial blindness, and significant hearing loss, suggests groups sometimes slowed their pace, stayed longer in one location, or otherwise adjusted their entire survival strategy around a member who needed time to heal. That's not survival of the fittest in the way the phrase gets thrown around today. That's survival of the time supported. Here's the counterintuitive twist, though. This system, deep botanical knowledge, tight social bonds, mutual obligation wasn't an extra layer added onto survival. It was survival. The plants, the people, the social debts, the shared memory, these weren't separate from the struggle to stay alive. They were the actual mechanism. And here's where it gets uncomfortable to think about. In many ways, that system was more resilient than what a lot of people experience today. Think about how isolated illness can feel now. You might be sick alone in an apartment, miles from anyone who knows you're struggling, scrolling through symptoms on a screen, waiting for an appointment 3 weeks out. The infrastructure around you is enormous: hospitals, pharmacies, insurance systems, but the immediate person-to-person network that ancient humans relied on by default has, for many people, quietly disappeared. Modern medicine can do things ancient humans could never have dreamed of. Surgery without 31,000-year-old guesswork. Antibiotics that don't depend on which plants happen to be growing nearby. None of this is about romanticizing the past illnesses that are minor inconveniences today were often fatal back then. But the social architecture, the expectation that when someone falters, others step in without being asked, that caregiving isn't a burden, but a debt that flows in both directions over a lifetime. That part wasn't a luxury our ancestors could afford to lose. It was load-bearing. So the next time you're sick and someone checks in on you, brings you soup, or simply sits with you for a while, that small act is carrying something much older than it looks. It's an echo of a system tens of thousands of years old, a system where getting sick wasn't a private failure to manage alone, but a signal that activated an entire network of people whose job in that moment was simply to make sure you didn't have to face it by yourself. You wake up with a fever, and for the first time, maybe you notice you're not actually facing it alone either.